Welcome to today's lesson, the land use planning process with a particular focus on agriculture. So first we want to look at some of the motivations for agricultural growth in Trinidad. So in Trinidad and Tobago, we have had a progressively growing population over the past 50 years or so. Within recent times, that growth has slowed just a bit, but yet it continues to grow. So where you have a growing population, there will obviously be a consequential need for greater demand for food. So as a result, we can say that this has been the major motivation behind the growth of our agricultural sector. Oftentimes you would find as well that where there is modest to increase growth in the income or the GDP of any country, you find that would also be another major driver behind the growth and the evolution of your agricultural sector. For example, you tend to find in more affluent countries, you would find that there's a greater demand for meat, fruits and vegetables, whereas you find in poorer countries the agricultural sector may be just focused on the basics, for example the carbohydrates such as rice, etc. So where you have this greater demand for meats, for example, remember that is livestock farming as well. So now you have an even increased demand for land space to facilitate all of this. And as a result, you find there are shifts in the consumption patterns of your country now, and this is reflected in your agricultural systems. So Trinidad and Tobago has been experiencing a reduction in our agricultural production in relation to our total production. And the reason for this is that because we have had such an increase in focus on our industrial sector, in particular our petroleum sector, this is happening at the expense of our food production. So we find that our agricultural production has actually been reducing in favor of the petroleum sector. Despite growing investments and technological improvements into agriculture, however, you would also find that related to that we have slowing agricultural yields. And there could be many reasons for that. One of the reasons is because we now have depleted soils. So despite the availability of a greater amount of capital or even technology such as mechanization, etc., the use of fertilizers, we find that our agricultural yields are not what they used to be. And a major reason for that is depleting or degrading soil quality. We also have patterns of increased food losses and wastage, which has become the norm in society like ours. For example, you find that the average household, we find that we have a lot of food waste associated with our daily activities, even on the agricultural production side as well. Many times you find that a lot of the produce that may not meet market standards would be discarded because they're considered of low quality or low grade that cannot be sent to the markets. And so what you find is reduction in this area. If we can find ways to reduce this wastage, we find that there would also be a consequential reduction in the need to increase our agricultural production. So that increase in food waste is also contributing and driving to a need for increased agricultural production. As mentioned before, our degraded natural resources, the degraded soil quality, we find that associated with modern agricultural systems, we have a loss of biodiversity we know this would be related to disruption in the ecological balance. Also, the fact that we also tend to engage in a lot of intensive farming, specializing in certain species rather than having a balanced, diverse type of agricultural activity taking place. Also related to that is the increase in pests and diseases, and this is actually also often synonymous with monoculture activities. So we find that our a lot of our species are endangered. Even the health of the plants and the livestock that we are rearing, they become threatened. Climate change also has a major impact on the productivity and the success of our agricultural activities. So climate change can affect productivity levels of the crops and the livestock. For example, where we have extremes of climate such as droughts and floods, on the one hand it's not sufficient water supply, on the other hand it's too much. We find that this often results in famine. It affects our crop yields, the ability of the to produce abundance of crops. When growing seasons change, and in particular you find an inability to predict the seasons and the weather, it can affect your productivity levels. It increases the probability and the likelihood of disease and pests with these extreme conditions. So of course I'm sure you can imagine the negative effects of climate change on our agricultural production in circumstances such as these. So generally we find that changes in our climatic conditions would often increase the greenhouse gases and gas emissions, and these things, as I mentioned before, can affect our different season, unpredictability of our growing seasons, etc. We find that there is also an increase in deforestation. All of these things will contribute to soil erosion and degradation of our lands and our soils, all of which would affect our productivity levels. Now let's look briefly at the issue of global hunger. So we find that despite global reduction in hunger and poverty, there is also a disproportionate distribution of food. So there are many parts of the world where you find that there would be an abundance of food. Agricultural activity would be booming, and there is really no shortage of food in certain parts of the world. But there are other parts of the world where there is a deficit. There is insufficient food. We hear about some of these places on the news all the time, where we have countries where there are food shortages in various parts of sub-Saharan Africa, certain parts of Asia, etc. So we have a disproportionate distribution of this food, even though when we look at global figures, it appears to be that there is a reduction in the amount in the average figures for hunger and poverty. And there are many reasons associated with that. But when you look at those differences, you find that the abundance would be concentrated in affluent countries, and the deficits would be concentrated in your poorer countries. So where you have in poorer countries, many times food may be available, but at times you find the quality of the food would not be such that it would encourage good health. So you find a lot of malnutrition taking place in those countries as well. So additionally, you would find that where you have access to large supplies of capital, you find that this results in a concentration of production in the hands of a few. So what we are talking about now is we have a situation where we find a balance of power and a balance of access to resources being now placed in the hands of large commercial entities at the expense of small producers. And you find oftentimes with the small producers, many of them will end up having to go out of business because they're often forced to go elsewhere looking for employment. But the impacts on the environment can be very detrimental, because where you have large commercial farming activities taking place, as mentioned before, this is where you would often find concentration on mono-agricultural activities, which, as we've already pointed out, is detrimental to the overall health of our environment. So these, when as an environmental planner, when you're looking at agricultural systems, these are things you need to take into consideration, because a diversity of agricultural activities is what is important in order to maintain the health of your environment. Also related to this particular situation, you find that you have a deficit now in terms of availability of labor. You find males would migrate to urban areas in search of work, often leaving behind women and children behind in the farming and agricultural regions. Let's look briefly at the impact of external and unexpected factors on agricultural systems. For example, where you have conflicts, civil wars, and natural disasters, these are all things that would be out of the control of land use planners. These kinds of situation increases the frequency and intensity of negative impacts on the agricultural sector. These kinds of situations can literally physically damage and destroy agricultural lands and agricultural assets. As a result, you find that this reduces food availability, as well as disrupt food access and health care. So those who need the food most, not only is it reduced, not only is the quantity is reduced, but you also find the ability to have access to the food by those who need it most is reduced. Many times in these kinds of situations where there have been conflicts, wars, natural disasters, you find that the food will often end up in the hands of those in control, whether it is the government, whether it is illegal authorities, those taking over the country by force, etc. So you find a lot of corruption taking place. So many people will often be pushed into poverty and hunger, and these factors can fuel migration and major humanitarian needs. For example, we find that we have this very situation occurring in places like Syria right now, where United Nations have already identified these areas as being in humanitarian crisis, not only in terms of food, but in terms of medical care, etc. And of course, also related to that, you find that there would be violent conflicts arising over competition for food because of the scarcity of food. So what are some of the threats to food production apart from what we've already discussed? Intensive farming, such as the large commercial farming activities mentioned, can often cause massive deforestation, so the clearing of land to gain access for agricultural activities. Water scarcities, you find water sources would be diverted into these agricultural areas, thereby depriving possibly other rural communities of water. You have soil depletion, because the soil is being depleted of specific nutrients and minerals as a result of this kind of concentrated farming. High levels of greenhouse gases being produced as a result of the type of farming activities taking place. So there's a great need for innovations in these areas in order to protect and enhance the natural resources, as mentioned before, your soils, your water scarcity, water quality, etc. While at the same time, You want to be able to increase your productivity. So you need that, you need to achieve that delicate balance between the two. So holistic approaches are very much needed. Some of these approaches would be specialized areas of agriculture, such as agroecology, agroforestry. These terms have been defined below for you. Climate smart agriculture, conservation agriculture. For example, we're talking about things like mixed farming, where you have each type of activity that you engage in is contributing something positive to the environment, and rather than depleting your environment and soils of various things, various nutrients. So a new way of thinking is necessary to make our food systems more efficient and more sustainable. Responsible investments of capital into areas of priority. As mentioned before, some of these areas of priority are the various areas of agricultural specializations and activities, such as the agroecology, conservation agriculture. There must be concern for smallholder livelihoods, as mentioned before, the small farmers. Large-scale farming, large-scale intensive farming tends to promote environmental degradation much more so than a small-scale farming. So you want to really take into consideration the role for small farming activities if you are a planner engaged in looking at your agricultural systems. There must also there are also needs to be there also needs to be more concern for the environmental footprint and its effect on the food chains, because remember, as we mentioned before, many of these agricultural activities consume a lot of natural resources, land resources, water, soils, and it's pretty massive. And each of these activities we know can have a significant impact on our environment, and at the end of the day there can be a negative feedback that comes right back to us as a human being, not only in terms of food quantities and quality, but also in terms of water scarcity, water quality. Much of your water supply can become polluted as a result of your agricultural activities, and then of course your land space as well. Remember, land space is finite, so when you consume land space, there is no more to be gained. The impacts on biodiversity. When we change the ecological balance through intensive farming methods, we increase the risk of loss of our biological diversity. And again, when species are lost, as mentioned before, our food chain can be disrupted. That causes an imbalance that causes an ecological balance that can negatively feed right back to us. Let's look briefly at sustainable agriculture. Sustainable agriculture rests on the premise that we must meet the food needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to feed itself, to meet its own needs. When the production of food and other materials degrade the natural resource base, the ability of future generations to produce and to flourish also decreases. So we have to bear in mind the agricultural systems that we use today, if not done wisely, can have a negative impact on future generations to produce food for itself. Sustainable agriculture must care about how we conserve our water supplies and the quality of water. So again, here we bring up the issue of water quantity first, how much water is available, and then of course the quality of the water. Sustainable agriculture also looks at the sources of renewable energy that are available. Much of the type of energy being used in the agricultural systems today come from non-renewable sources. You're still looking at petroleum-based fuels for machinery. Then you're looking at many of the different products, the pesticides, etc., that fertilizers that are being used also having a non-renewable base. Sustainable agriculture requires an increased use of energy sources from renewable resources in order to be sustainable. Soil erosion and soil quality must also be addressed. Remember, this is a critical resource for any type of agriculture. So when our soils become degraded, obviously this has a negative impact on your ability to produce food. So soil erosion and soil quality must be addressed. As mentioned before, crop diversification, including when you're looking at livestock, diversification within your livestock as well. This must be enhanced to preserve biological stability of your farming systems. Because remember, as mentioned before, anytime you produce intensively using one type of crop, as you find in systems around the world, such as wheat production, corn, etc., that actually creates environmental problems that produces that negative feedback into the system that always comes back to us as a human being. So land use planning can be advantageous for sustainable agriculture. Some of the ways, for example, applying land use principles can direct urban-like development, such as your residential areas, away from lands that are designated for agricultural activities. So you're talking about zoning and creating zoning based on guidelines. For example, we have conflicts happening right now in Trinidad and Tobago as of 2018, where we find that there were conflicts over the proposed use of agricultural lands in the St. Augustine area, where you find the Trinidad and Tobago Agricultural Society is in conflict with the HDC, which is proposing the use of those agricultural lands for housing developments. So these are some kind of issues that could be avoided if you have well-established and well-regulated land use development and zoning. As a result, you find that land use planning can minimize subdivisions and wasteful use of productive farmlands. It can direct livestock operations away from developed areas. Where you have unmanaged and unregulated land use management in those situations, you find a lot of agricultural and livestock waste can end up in rivers, etc., affecting communities downstream from these activities. Land use planning can identify priority environmental issues that need to be addressed, such as water pollution, soil erosion in areas, and as a result you can apply better management practices, better agricultural practices to minimize these environmental issues. Land use management uses separation distances recommended for farming practices based on guidelines to separate activities such as livestock farming operations and developments, as mentioned before. So this for example can be to apply buffer distances where you believe the environmental and health impact would be minimized, and it also accommodates certain types of businesses that can support agricultural activities within the designated area, such as to encourage the development of businesses such as agricultural supply stores, farmers markets. So you find all of these would be activities that would be complementary to agricultural systems. Let's look briefly at the agricultural profile of Trinidad and Tobago. So the central region of Trinidad has the largest amount of agricultural land cover that have been identified between 1996 to 2006, so that 10-year period. South Central has the largest increase in agricultural land cover, increasing by a whopping 115% in 2006. The South Central area, that same area, seems to be gaining agriculture mainly from forest. So here we are being including that you find some deforestation taking place at the expense of agricultural activities. Agriculture has lost out to the built development in the northwest portion of Trinidad, and that has been taking place for us a fair amount of time, because we know that that area of Trinidad, not only northwest but also stretching across the east-west corridor, is predominantly urbanized. And then we also have the smallest change in agricultural land cover taking place in the northeast of Trinidad at only 6%. There was evidence of a slow in the rate of agricultural growth that we're talking about nationally now, and this is due to general unattractiveness of agriculture as a means of sustainable livelihood, especially amongst the young people. So we find there's a lack of interest in getting involved in agricultural activities amongst the young people. In Tobago, agriculture accounts for 5 square kilometers of all the land cover in Tobago. Tobago has a total land area of 300 square kilometers. So the agricultural activities is relatively small. The land cover changes, the changes now are also relatively small, except for a 186% increase in the built development. So we're finding that agricultural land cover has been minimal, but the built environment has significantly increased. And the amount of agriculture and swamp cover remains relatively unchanged. So the thing to note here about Tobago is agriculture is changing minimally, whereas the built environment is increasing significantly. Now here we're looking at some of the functions and responsibilities of what is now called today the Ministry of Agriculture. Remember, from one government regime to another, you find that names of ministries may change, but many of the functions and responsibilities would remain the same. So some of the responsibilities and functions of this ministry is production, agricultural production, and distribution of high quality planting material. So they make available to the farmers a lot of high quality crop seeds, etc. Promotion of animal health and disease control, distribution of genetically improved livestock, and provision of specialized veterinarian services. So they provide assistance and support to the farmers in all of these areas. They also are involved in capacity building of the farmers through agricultural extension services, such as providing training to the farmers, advice, guidance on their agricultural activities, etc. So they would often have staff available to go out to these various agricultural regions to interact with and to provide these services. The Ministry of Agriculture also provides fishery extension advice, conservation and management of living marine resources, and enforcement of fisheries regulations. So similarly, the way in which they would provide advice and support for crop farmers, they also provide the same for fisheries and fishermen, fishing communities, etc. Additionally, they provide technical advisory services and conduct of physical infrastructure works related to farm irrigation, and drainage, access road development. So we're talking about technical advisory services and also provision and guidance of engineering advice where necessary, because as you can tell, even agricultural activities will require a certain amount of agricultural engineering expertise. They also manage state lands, which includes the acquisition of lands as well as the distribution of state lands to farmers. So you find, for example, farmers would have access to leasing state lands to facilitate the development of agricultural activities. They also undertake relevant agricultural research and development of technological packages for increasing agricultural production and productivity, and they provide up-to-date information and review and update of agricultural legislation. So what are some of the challenges to sustainable farming in Trinidad and Tobago? Some of these we would have mentioned before. For example, we have our rapid urbanization taking place in both islands, as we've already seen. And when this occurs, you find this happens at the expense of forests. So we have deforestation occurring. We have the loss of good fertile lands to the expense of building residential and commercial and industrial activities. We also have the loss of labor occurring through rural-urban migration as a result of the displacement of small farmers as well. We have a rapid and intensive industrialization taking place in Trinidad and Tobago, particularly on the Trinidad side, and this reduces the emphasis on agriculture, as we've already seen. We also have inadequate infrastructure, such as access to roads. Many of our agricultural areas do not have proper road access for the farming activities to take place. Yet on the other hand, we find we may have better roads occurring in residential area. So there is a disparity in the development of infrastructure in various sector areas. Another hindrance for sustainable development and sustainable agricultural activities in Trinidad is the fact that there is that dependence on rainwater supplies for agricultural activities. So you find that this will often result in low yields in your food production during the dry season. As a result, you will have competition for water resources, the minimal available resources that might be available, such as groundwater supplies, etc. And then during the rainy season now, you find we would have to deal with flooding, which will often result in loss of crop production, etc. So this can result in some extreme of circumstances for us here in Trinidad and Tobago that makes it difficult to sustain and to keep up a good level of food production on a national level. So at this point, I'd like to thank you for joining me for today's lesson. Please proceed to the activity provided for this week. Thank you.